Hello and welcome to Motivation Part 3 notes on sexual motivation. So again, we'll be looking at the definition of motivation, that energizing behavior that's set towards a goal. And last notes, we looked about how hunger can play a role in motivation. And now we're going to look at how sex or sexual tendencies can play a role in motivation or behavior. Okay, so these notes, I'll just get into it. There we go. So I was talking with a couple of you staying after school today, lucky you, about some really interesting studies that have done on the physiology of sex, and we were having a chuckle. But there's been legitimate psychological experiments done with the physiology of sex, so the actual physical acts of sex and then the mental components that go along with it. And these were all done by participants in a study that willingly agreed to have their bodies tested during sex or masturbation. Think about that for a little bit. But from those willing observers and participants, we have all this information on what the body actually goes through during sex, why we are motivated, what's the difference between women and men for sexual drive, and so on and so forth. So here's the actual biology of the sexual response cycle. So the sexual response cycle is a cycle, meaning that it goes in a circle, starts at one place, ends at another, and can be repeated. Okay, so the first stage of the sexual response cycle when someone is excited, so that could be either internal, external, we'll talk about that in just a second, but once they get to that or start that excitement phase, they hit something called the plateau phase, the orgasm, and then the resolution phase, so like coming back to resting. And that time going back to resting is called the refractory period in males, and it's the amount of time it takes after the orgasm resting to get back to where a male can achieve another orgasm. Okay, so that's the sexual response cycle. Believe me, if this wasn't on an AP test, I would not be talking about this with you right now. Okay, so now let's talk about the hormones that are associated with that cycle. So there's two effects of hormones and then two hormones you're going to need to know for the test. So the two effects of hormones on sexual behavior are, first of all, to develop sexual characteristics. So at a very young age, testosterone and estrogen in the fetus, so a developing body, allow those sexual organs to develop. So the presence of testosterone in a fetus, an unborn child, makes the testes start to develop. Okay, so the development of sexual characteristics at a young age and then older. So then also testosterone and estrogen play a big part during puberty, right? So those hormones build up again, and then you get the appearance of secondary sexual characteristics, like women's breast development and hips, and then in males like the facial hair and the lowering of the voice. Okay, so that's one effect of hormones, is just physical changes of development, sexual characteristics. And the second one is sexual behavior. So behaviors that are meant to end in or by attracting a mate, to attract a mate. These are especially true in non-humans. So the mating behaviors of the male peacock, the like splaying of the feathers and like the certain strut. So hormones play a factor in those behaviors. In humans, it's a little different because we don't have like classic mating strategies. In other animals, they are. There's very characteristic, procedure that they go through to attract other mates. Okay, so estrogen is going to be our classic female hormone. You need to know that both these hormones are present in both females and males, but estrogen is our classic like female hormone, and this fluctuates throughout a woman's life and then throughout the month, right? So estrogen peaks during ovulation when an egg is released, and then it goes down afterwards. And then hold on just a second. I don't know where I left off. But what I was talking about estrogen is people who are trying to get pregnant actually measure their levels of estrogen and see like at what point of the month they would be more likely to get pregnant, because that's the point where the estrogen peaks. Okay, so testosterone, so that's the female estrogen classic hormone. Testosterone is our male hormone. Again, both females and male have it, but this stimulates growth of sex organs in a fetus and then also development during puberty. So testosterone also been linked to aggression or aggressive behavior in males because they have more testosterone. Okay, so now let's talk about the psychology of sex. So this is all the biology of sexual motivation. Let's talk about the psychology, so the feelings or the thoughts that go behind it. So I said earlier that aroused state is either because of external or internal stimuli. So stimuli, remember, something that elicits a response. So external can be things that you see, hear. So think about any of the senses, right? And what they've actually found is external stimuli, like looking at erotic photos or videos or just a picture of someone really pretty. Oh, great, the lights are going off. Is actually the same for males as it is for females, even though males are classically more like turned on by external stimuli. It just activates different parts of the brain. So females, when looking at pictures of external stimuli, so a pretty woman or male or suggestive photos, actually have their amygdala. So when you're looking at fMRIs of these brains, so their amygdala, so their emotions are more engaged, versus in males it's more of like the primitive brain, like the more like sex drive part of it. Okay, and imagined stimuli, the brain is actually said to be like the biggest sexual organ, because we've talked about how powerful dreams and sexual fantasies could be. Remember, if you're imagining it happening, it's in your brain, it's almost just as powerful. And there have been some interesting research done with people that are paralyzed, so have no feeling below their their legs, or then the paraplegics, nothing below their neck, still have sexual fantasies and still have those feelings of being aroused, even though they don't have feeling in the sexual organs, right? So they're still, because they can imagine in their brain, have the same type of arousal states as they do even with the sex organ. So that's why the brain is said to be so powerful. All right, so let's look at the levels of analysis for sexual motivation. So you have your biology influences. You can just sketch this down again and pause. Let me go through all of them, and then we can write this down in class. So leave some space in your notes for these levels of analysis again. But know that there's this biology influence, a psychological influence, and then a social cultural influence, a big social cultural influence on sexual motivation. Okay, so let's talk about adolescence and sexuality. So teens. So this point of your life where your bodies are changing, there tends to be a high rate of teen pregnancy. So let's see if I can fix the lights real quick. Okay, so there's been these studies about if there's high teen pregnancies, why? What's the reason? It's not because teens are stupid. It's not because they don't understand. There's actually been these different things or studies done that have come up with these 5 points about why during adolescence, teens are more likely to get pregnant. The first of all, ignorance, and that doesn't mean that like stupidity, but just not knowing exactly that every time you have sex, you can get pregnant, right? There's so many myths out there that like, oh, this or that, but that ignorance of just not believing that sex equals pregnancy, all right? There's minimal communication about birth control, either because of school or parents or religious reasons. There's not a lot of information out there unless you go search for it. But there's also this guilt that's related to sexual activity. It is not looked upon highly to be a sexually active teen. So if you're feeling guilty about it, you'd be less likely to go look for birth control, right? So it's those guilt, they're the feelings that are associated with it, not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to confront it, often lead to teen pregnancy. Alcohol use, so experimenting with alcohol and drugs, we talked about it gets rid of your inhibitions, more likely to have sex if you're drinking. And just the mass media, so right, the sociology of norms of unprotected promiscuity, meaning that sexuality is looked upon as good, right? You're a sexy, when I say a sexual picture of a person or a woman, sexuality that is like, oh, that's what guys want. In the guy's point of view, like that's what girls want, is to kind of have that sexual being. And then that mass media of like, this is what accepted, but don't talk about it. don't ever have conversations about it. Oh my gosh, I can't even believe Miss Meyer's talking about it right now, right? Because it's so taboo to talk about. And these are all these things that can contribute to teen pregnancy because you're uninformed, don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing, right? I'm talking about in a room by myself right now. That's weird, okay? And then just that media influence on it, all right? So statistics of STIs, I was going to leave that for your health class, but we'll talk about it in class as well. And then there are studies done, so why teens become pregnant, and then why teens are abstinent. So why don't they? So teens who tend to be abstinent, meaning that they refrain from sexual activity, they have been shown to have higher IQs, okay? There tends to be some type of religious engagement, so their families are religious or they attend church a lot. There's been studies that shown that girls that have fathers tend to have lower rates of teen pregnancy because they're not sexually active, so having a positive father figure in their life. And then participation in service learning programs, just meaning open talking about it, open information, here's the risk, here's the STD information. So participating in those type of programs actually leads to higher teen abstinence, so more teens not having sex. All right, we have 3 slides or 2 slides on sexual orientation and then we're done, okay? So sexual orientation, some terms that you probably are pretty familiar with, but sexual orientation refers to whether or not a person is homosexual, homo meaning the same, right? So like someone of the same sex, or heterosexual. Hetero is opposite. We talked about these in biology, like being homozygous or heterozygous, the same or opposite. Orientation, meaning that that sexual arousal, going back to the first slide, comes from people of the same sex or comes from people of the opposite sex, okay? Statistics have shown with them, so there's been some things shown out there that like 10% of the population, but with truly anonymous surveys and nationwide, it has been shown about 3 to 4% of men self-claim to be homosexual, and then 1 to 2% of women claim to be homosexual. So that means like on a survey, anonymous, no like what I'm going to say, reprimanding for what they put on their survey. So 3 to 4% of men, 1 to 2% of women. And here are some quick notes on orientation or sexual orientation, the origins. So there's been studies, as in everything, about what leads to someone being homosexual or what leads to someone being heterosexual. So the studies that have done a lot of stuff with fraternal birth order effect. So looking at brothers and sisters and the order in which they were born and whether or not that had an effect on sexual preference. So the fraternal birth order effect, this would actually be italicized, it's like a vocab word in my book, is a study that was done that said that males that are born, so brothers born from the same mother, the second brother is more likely to be homosexual than the first. So there has to be a tendency of increasing homosexuality as you go down the birth order. So second son is more likely than first, and the third is more likely than the second. So that implies that there may be some type of biological, like, or because of something changing in the womb of the mother. All right, so kind of skipping down to prenatal hormones and sexual orientation. So because if they're born from the same mother, they're coming from the same environment. There's a lot of things that change in the womb or the uterus of the woman as it goes from one to the other. And it's been thought that something that happens there might change a male's predisposition to be homosexual or heterosexual. All right. Other things or origins of sexual orientation. We see same attraction in all animals, meaning that this is not just humans. Observations of animals in the zoos or in the wilderness show the same tendencies. They are either heterosexual or homosexual, and they tend to stick with that orientation through nature. Right. So it's not a bisexual curiosity where they're just trying it out, but they tend to stick with that through life. The brain and sexual orientation. So there was a psychologist who was gay that was really curious about why he was the way he was. And he actually did a study with autopsies of brains of people who were homosexual and people who are heterosexual. And it was a blind study. So he really wanted to be, what I'm going to say, didn't want to mess up any results or have any implications. So he said, do not tell me which brains are coming from which people. I just want to look at brain tissues, and he found an area on the hypothalamus that was larger. There's a cluster of cells that was different in people who are homosexual from heterosexual, and also found that the hemispheres tended to differ in sizes. So after he came back with all his data and looked at it all, he found these differences in the brains of homosexual and heterosexual people. All right, so genes. There's a slight correlation between identical twins and homosexuality, meaning that a twin who is homosexual, their identical twin is slightly more. Not a huge correlation though, but is slightly more likely to be homosexual than fraternal twins or brothers and sisters. So there might be a genetic component. And in fruit flies, researchers have actually found that there's a gene that they can insert into a fruit fly to make a female fly act more like a male and a male act more like a female. So they think they've identified a gene in flies. And then I already talked about the prenatal hormones and sexual orientation, that there might be some hormones that change while the fetus is developing that affects sexuality or sexual orientation. Okay, so that's the end of our sexual notes or sexual motivation. Next notes are going to be on the need to belong. Again, I think the lights went on and off about 5 times during this lecture. I'll see you later.